A Dark Place for Sheep by Knial R. Piper II. Chapter 3. I can remember standing out beneath the cold gray clouds that blanketed the sky as we watched the barn burn to the ground. I felt a coarse despair working its way through my veins. I had failed that boy, those men, and my family. I had also failed to extinguish the fire. It felt as if a lifetime of hard work was falling apart before me, one dissolving board at a time, up in flames right before my very eyes. In its wake, it left only dark columns of smoke to mix with the clouds above. My family, the strangers, and I all stood in a line outside the fiery heap that was once our barn. The flames crackled under the ominous and darkening sky. I removed the multifocal glasses that miraculously remained clipped to my shirt collar. With them in my grip, I dropped my hand beside me, only to let the spectacles fall to the grass beside my feet. I tried to fight off my despair. I searched my mind for something positive. I was thankful Vernon had mistakenly left all the horses in the field only a day prior. Theodore jumped with fright when the roof caved in. I turned to console him, and switching my attention I became aware that the scar-faced man was absent from our crowd. I immediately knew where he was, so I went there too. I made my way to the back porch. As I entered through the open door, my wife held the children in the yard. The other strangers followed close behind me. I grabbed the support beam of the porch awning. I peered down the hallway to the foyer at the foot of the stairs. My sight centered on the grieving man. He was kneeling in his brother's bile. He was holding that unsacred corpse in his arm, just like one would hold a baby. The tears from his face dripped onto the lifeless thing cradled in his arms. The blood spilled over his sleeves and onto my floor. Despite all the man's despair, there was a clear and present anger within me. I shelved any pity that requested my attention. Then I condemned the men with my commands. "You leave now!" I was worried about their response. "Leave right now and never come back!" Much to my surprise, they did not fight me. The bearded men came from behind me and knelt down to grab the scar-faced man by his elbows. Still cradling his disfigured brother and still sorrowful, the men led him out of the front door and away from there, away from us. I watched them depart down the steps and across our front yard. They took to their horses and disappeared into the mountain's gap. As the valley swallowed them, I felt the mountains as I never had before. It was as if they were showing off their unchanging prowess. They were grandiose and immovable. They were testaments of time, great powers beyond my puny mind. I imagined those mountains had seen men like those strangers before. I hadn't a clue what to do or say. I felt lost and confused. I chose to walk out in front of the yard and stare at the mountains with a blank mind. I wasn't sure how much time had passed while I watched those men disappear from my sight. 10 minutes? An hour? It felt like a lifetime. My wife's hand startled me as she laid it gently onto my shoulder. Each finger felt placed so perfectly upon my sweat-drenched shirt. I could feel each bone in her hand as they trembled. Theodore and Kenneth joined our embrace from behind. They each grabbed a hold of one of my legs, wrapping both of their tiny arms firmly around me. I managed to turn around and pull them loose. They were both crying. I hadn't usually considered compassion a strength until that moment. I had told them many times how it was. Boys don't cry. It was a cruel lesson for a cruel world. I wanted to bless them as my father had blessed me, teaching my kin that only strong boys grow up to be strong men. But for a split second, with the blood staining our floorboards, my words meant less. I instinctively placed my hands on their heads. I knelt and kissed them both on their foreheads. I wiped the tears from their cheeks before I stood up. Not once did I let my brewing emotions plague my face. A breeze swept in, thankfully took my attention. My stare again fixed itself on the mountains. "Listen to your mother. Be good boys," I spoke softly. "Everything will be okay." My words alone provided them little solace. Not even I felt their truth. My mind was still off in the distant mountain pass. Father? Kenneth asked. Will that happen to us? I came back to the present. I paused before speaking, then looked at Charlotte. Her face was also a far place from comfort. She had also appeared lost in her own 1,000-mile stare. But she still managed to look back my way. I saw the thick concern painted across her face. It formed the kind of face a murder victim shares with her killer in the last seconds of life. I turned back to Theodore, then to Kenneth. I had seen Kenneth many a time display courage in order to guide his little brother through life's difficult stories. He was a strong and brave older brother. I expected his bravery in all matters, but it felt different then. I hadn't wished for any of that. It was beyond life's lessons, an exception. This will never happen to you, I promised. I meant it. Now you two be good boys and go to your rooms. Your mom will be there shortly. I forced a slight yet sincere smile. They relaxed a bit, then turned to dash through a puddle of blood on the front steps. Their tiny feet left tiny crimson footprints with each step through the hallway. My wife and I could not let it bother us. We walked near one another back toward the house until we embraced mid-stride. I carried her under my arm, hers wrapped around my lower back. Though we held one another, I couldn't feel my wife. Not beneath her visceral fear. It was as if she were terrified that something would reach out and grab her at any moment. I reckon she felt as I did, but I refused to share that frightened part of me with her. We needed all the symbols of strength we could produce. Charlotte was more forthcoming than I. I don't feel safe here, Bruce. Her words were certain. I didn't dare doubt them. I couldn't help but bring my eyes to the column of smoke rising from behind our house. Behind our home was months of sweat and effort, literally going up in flames. It was left only to exist in time immemorial, unable to be captured. And so, with my arm still upon my wife's bony shoulders, I pulled her into me. I held her close, afraid that anything else of her should be left behind. She felt solid, and her presence softened my anger. Charlotte, my beautiful wife, I'm going to deal with this. What are you going to do? Her eyes connected with mine as we turned to engage. I slipped my worn hand around her biceps and reassuringly squeezed them for her attention. She provided it with a taut awe. Yet any relief had already dissipated far, far away, like smoke into the sky. I'm going to get some answers. I'm going to make sure we are safe. I can't just let this go. I don't know what that was or how something like that happens, but I'll be damned if my family is caught again unprepared. Whatever that was, it won't be our family's demise. She scoffed. I don't believe it. She raised her chin, holding the tears back. She forced her eyes upward, but ultimately failed to conceal her sharp emotions. Then she rolled her stare back to the mountains. I was left to stare at the back of her head. I bit my bottom lip as I searched for answers. I couldn't stand to see her like that. I needed to further comfort her. I needed to be strong, be the man she needed. You don't have to believe, but something must be done. She was playing with the front of her neck as she often did when she grew nervous. I grabbed her hand from there and held it between mine. She turned to face me again as I spoke. Trust me, it's going to be okay. I mustered the words as confidently as possible. I wished for her to believe me, but her gaze reached far beyond my bravado. Like the kids, I couldn't always tell if she believed my words, but I carried on as if she had anyway. I followed my remarks with, Now go get the kids and make sure they are okay. Have them help you clean the house up, but be careful. Wear gloves, and don't touch any of that strange liquid. We don't know what those substances truly are. Could be dangerous. If you have any trouble, Vernon will be here in a few days to do the rest. Thursday, I reckon. She didn't respond. I let go of her hand and turned to the front door. As I entered the house, I reached out for the grainy and splintering coat rack. I grabbed my old brown bowler and dirty leather coat. Then I headed for the pasture. When I passed by Charlotte, I saw that her hand had returned to her neck. Her watery stare still belonged to those mountains. Mine did as well. And so I planned to ride into those mountains and ease our minds. I'll be back, I said as I lifted myself onto the best horse. His name was Ridley. He was a strong horse with the endurance of a war stallion. He was always an obedient and loyal companion, always a reliable ride into town, always my friend. I cared for him as one does a family member. For that reason, I would not have chosen any other horse for such an important matter. I rode him out against the breeze, right then and there, with my wife watching from our front porch. Ridley and I disappeared. Ridley's walk became a trot, and then his trot became a run. And from there we raced to the same mountain pass those strangers had ventured into. The dust rose from behind us, only to be pierced by the flinging of rocks from under his hooves. We had no time to waste if we were going to catch up with our mysterious visitors. I was determined to catch those men and uncover the source of their vileness. The level of insecurity those men had left us with had to be done away with. I needed answers, and as the town's primary physician, I couldn't trust that whatever those men had brought with them would not make its way into the town's population. Evanston would not stand a chance against such a cursed nature. I didn't even want to consider the consequences if that supposed disease managed to get on the railways. As I rounded a second corner with the mountains towering above and the hills behind, I finally spotted them. 3 figures on horseback were at the final fork in the road. They were moving at a slow but steady pace, a funeral procession. The man holding his brother was in front. The other 2 held confident postures, which felt eerily secure for such a bizarre situation having just passed. I decided at that moment not to make myself known to them. Instead, I pulled at Ridley's reins and walked him backwards and out of sight. A large rock near the foot of the nearest mountain provided sufficient concealment. From there, I watched as the 2 beards in the back rode up beside their defeated partner. They all began to share a short conversation. Meanwhile, Ridley was growing restless. He shook his head and snorted. I placed a hand on his neck and begged him to calm down, boy, calm. Unfortunately, the men heard our commotion. They turned around to search for whatever it was they thought they had heard. They had heard something, but they didn't know what. They waited in silence, watching the trail behind them. I slid further back behind the rock, as close to the boulder as Ridley would allow. I joined the silence and prayed Ridley would do the same. After a short minute they resumed their distant conversation. When I heard the strangers move onward, Ridley and I followed. What caught me off guard was the path our strangers had taken. They did not head toward town. All 3 of the men had left, away from town. One could manage a path to Evanston by that way, but it was a considerable distance, even for an experienced surveyor. The town itself was not very big in relation to the cities of the East, but for Wyoming, it was an essential place to stop on the pilgrimage out west. There were only a handful of dirt roads that fed into town. They ran between the 4 blocks of buildings. One of those roads ended at the Baptist church that stood above the end of Sage Street. It was not too far from the Union Pacific Railway depot and the adjoining stone roundhouse. Just beyond Chinatown there were a slew of houses and tents scattered close to the position at the fork. But the path those men had taken would not lead them to any of it, not even to the wealthier residences on the other side of town. The strangers were further out than any residential plots, and they continued to move south, away from town. If they had moved any further that way, we would have all surely become lost in the desert. As I too took that left turn, my eyes caught the bustling town at the bottom of the valley. Pine trees grew in blotched patches around the hills not too far from Evanston. They existed like small oases in the dusty landscape between distant ridges. Evanston was central to it all, and the Union Pacific divided it all. I hadn't much time to ponder and stare. I felt Ridley resist my directions, but I forced him to the left. That day was no day for reflexive habits. It seemed the stars had aligned for our path into new territory. I kept the men in my sight at all times. I did not find the task terribly difficult. Staying concealed was more of a trick, but we managed. Luckily, the twists and turns that led south provided many opportunities to stay hidden, but it also presented many opportunities to lose sight of my hunt. As we reached the mouth of the pass, I hid for a moment. I listened as all their horses came to a halt. I came out from behind another overturned boulder to find I had lost sight of them. I panicked a bit and moved quickly from that place. We cleared the next corner, and it was there I saw the men entering the county forest. I waited until they were swallowed by it. I had but a few times been to the other outskirts of town, but I had never been into those woods. There had always been whispers of that place. Children told of the horrors that older men in town shared about that wicked wilderness. The terrain was scattered with unnatural trees growing up from rocky ground. All bad things came from there. In my mind, it was but silly fables, yet a part of me had allowed the myth to ingrain itself into my sense of logic. As the men faded to the black below the shadows of the clustered trees, I rode up to the tree line. Ridley stopped in front of the nearest branch. He wouldn't budge. He refused. "Come on, Ridley." I kicked him softly. Still he stood his ground. I looked at his brown mane, then once more stroked the side of his neck, attempting to show him encouraging kindness. "Ridley," I spoke softly. Yet he remained unpersuaded. I kicked him harder than I perhaps should have, but it did the job. The pain got him moving. Whether he intended it or not, we both moved forward, reluctantly. We too were swallowed by that darkness. The forest was unbelievably dense. The trees were so tightly packed, and the roots and low-hanging limbs were so tightly woven that I wondered how anyone could ever traverse any deeper into that place. Nevertheless, there was a path before us, and all three men had made their way far down into it, into the belly of the land. I tried to not give it much thought. I just made sure Ridley and I followed our targets. As the clouds grew darker, the leaves blotted out the sky. All the natural light was blackened into a starless night. It felt as though we had entered a cavern of endless abyss. With each step, Ridley's hooves cracked some fallen limb or dried leaf. The sounds rung like hollow echoes through those woods. I could not see the men in front of us any more. I for a moment reconsidered our venture. Yet, just as I did, the strangers ignited a lantern light. They were a good distance away, but close enough to guide us as well. Without our own guiding light, Ridley and I made the passage with more difficulty. We chased the eerie lamp glow further and further into the darkness. We were even deeper into the woods when my eyes sensed a second light, further back beyond the strangers. As we grew closer, it was apparent that there were other glowing lights. There were at least 5 other flames there. I soon saw that the other lanterns were hung on the outside of a small house. At first, I couldn't believe that anyone would have chosen to live so deep in those black woods. I didn't understand it. I couldn't believe that someone had managed to even build a house in that place. The trek alone was enough to wear a man out, let alone carry the necessary supplies for such construction. I could only surmise that the cabin had been built from those devilishly twisted trees. When my eyes adjusted to the area, I saw that I had surmised correctly. A home made from that place and of that place. In the dark, I was now the stranger. The end of Chapter 3 of A Dark Place for Sheep by Knial R. Piper II.